and we'll just continue to grow as we move forward. So first, I just want to thank you. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your willingness to share, not only in the diversity series, but the importance of your perspective on Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous Day as it is coming, formerly known as Columbus Day. So we're very glad to have you here and having a conversation about that, what that is and what that story might be that we want to tell about Indigenous Peoples Day. I thank you for coming and for the title of your presentation, which is Beyond the Discovery Narrative. What is the story we might want to tell about Indigenous Peoples Day? So with that, and without further ado, I'm going to let you start into your presentation, not only about the topic, but also I know you're going to do some sharing about your own research. And then, as I said before, as people start slowly creeping in from the P&T meeting, please don't be thrown off. Just continue on and we'll catch up with you as you go forward. Thank you for coming and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. So I must acknowledge my friend, Dr. Richard Fletcher. Thank you for being here, Dr. Fletcher. So happy to see you and know that you're holding space and holding me in the space. So thank you. And I don't think I know Alyssa, but it's so nice to have you here as we begin. So let me go ahead and share my screen.
Do you have control over the share?
I don't think I do.
All right, hold on. Let me make sure I can get into you and give you. All right, you should see the invite. You should be good.
Oh, yep. Well, let me go back to the beginning of my PowerPoint.
Okay.
You have to remember to close everything out when I'm doing this work. Oh, there's my dog. Can you see the PowerPoint?
No.
Oh, no.
No.
I can see it on my screen. So I didn't get the share invite, I guess. Let me try it again.
You should. It says it's your co-host. So you should have access.
One participant can share. Yep. There we go.
All right, there you go. Take it away.
Thank you. So again, thank you for having me, inviting me, Dr. Beard. I'm so honored to be here to talk about what is beyond the discovery narrative. So today, for my brief presentation introduction, to frame our conversation, I'll begin with a land acknowledgement or acknowledging the land and talking about why that's important. We'll move on to relating my story to beyond the discovery narrative, then connect through my research. Then what can we do about changing the narrative? And then spend the time, most of the time, in dialogue about what can we learn from this. So in acknowledging the land that holds us and that we receive life from, it's important to remember that land stewardship is our past, Indigenous people's past, and it's our future as well. So contextualizing it in that way. So naming the original stewards, as many of us do on the land that we live on today, I honor today the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, the Wyandotte, and all of those who were at once lived in this region now known as Ohio. When offering in land acknowledgement, I think it's important to understand how we reap the benefits of the relationship Indigenous people have and still have with the land as we enjoy an abundance of food, water, and medicine, and as well as acknowledging the loss of the rights to the land. So you may want to mention the treaty. And so we mentioned that the treaty is what removed the native peoples from this land and allowed a different kind of development to occur in this space. It's important that we recognize the presence of Indigenous peoples. So I honor all of those that are here with us today, both present and ancestrally, in joining this conversation and being present with us. And of course, we acknowledge the need for change, which is the whole reason for the presentation today. So to move forward with my story I center or ground it in floating, the notion of floating. A story of resilience, reclamation, and recovery. So I identify as Southern Ute, not enrolled. So I'm originally from California, West Coast girl, always. I was born and raised in the Bay Area, specifically in Fremont, and was raised by my mother and honor my mother today. Excuse me, my voice is a little scratchy. Shirley Elizabeth Bachelor Gonzales, who raised me along with her family, her parents, and her extended family, who predominantly lived in the Bay Area. So most of my mother's, that side of her family lived in the Bay Area. And on that side, we have Spanish and Scottish ancestry. In 1974, when I was 14, just turned 15, my father decided to change jobs, professions, and took us to Columbus, Ohio. His goal was, my father was a teacher and decided to go into, to be an entrepreneur. And so, but understanding college or school was important. He wanted to put us in what he deemed a great school. So we landed in, my sister and I and my younger brother landed in Upper Arlington, which is where I attended, finished high school, and graduated. So this lived experience, along with the story of transitioning from a diverse, culturally rich educational community to a non-diverse culture and educational community, significantly influenced my interest in teaching and learning, as well as critical and culturally centered pedagogical practices. So contributing to my story and who I am and what influences my research is my father's story, which some of you have heard before. So I will just share briefly that my Native identity is rooted in my lived experience as the daughter of a parent, William Gonzales, who survived being taken along with his other siblings by Colorado state officials from where he was living in southern Colorado near what is now known as Trinidad, in the middle of the southern part of California, to live and go to school about 400 miles away in Denver. He would spend most of his or all of his life, his schooling life here in Denver. So he was around 5 in 1935 when he arrived at the school with his siblings, and he stayed until he aged out at age 18 in 1947. So thinking about this influence and what, how this influenced my interest in pursuing education as a career, as a way to address my concerns about what happened in classrooms specifically, I noticed that I had a really pronounced awareness based on my experience about untold stories, problems with single perspectives, the missing voices in classrooms, and those that have been silenced. And here's a learning goal that reflects, I think, my experience is being raised by a boarding school survivor. And the goal of this particular residential school was to instill a profound distaste for Native life so that the students would be humiliated when reminded of their origin. And when they graduated from institution, the children would have forgotten everything except their blood. Everything about me being Native except their blood. So to tell my story, to frame my story, I rely now on a poem that was restoried by Dr. Timothy Sampedro and gifted to me as a way of helping me understand who I am and in this process of learning and growing. So I will share just a portion of the story. Here is where our stories combine, where stories swirl. Your story, as remarkable as it is difficult to share, was once silent in spaces of harm and disconnection, forced to carefully guard your identity. Still, you persisted, navigating spaces of inner exploration, discovering that which was always within you, layered stories of resistance and resilience, of tension and transformation, of loss and reclamation. This cycle is fluid, like rivers and creeks, like lakes and oceans, where water is forever ongoing. It includes your father and your daughter. And in that way, it includes you, recreated and renamed, your self-worth restored in sacred landscapes that serve as sources of knowledge. In your independence, you came to realize who your father was. You came to realize who your father was, provided clarity for who you are in this moment. You are more than the hegemonic experiment gone wrong. You are more than the severing of language and identity. You are more than the stories your father could not share. And so with any good story, some words are worth repeating. Beyond this space is where stories combine, where stories swirl. Beyond, you are powerful because you are your story. So as this pedagogical practice, Dr. Sampedro used as a way for us to, those that were in this class, to tell our who am I stories. We all had to write a paper and tell about who we are, who we were, who we are, who we wanted to share with the class. And so this was my story that he restoried. So stories have been an important part of storytelling, restoring, are an important part of Indigenous people, part of our culture and our customs and our tradition. So it also was a part of my research I grounded my research in storytelling. So what were the issues that I wanted to pursue? What were the themes? So the themes were matters of urban Indians have been largely overlooked in educational discourse. 2/3 of people who identify as Native American live in the cities, yet the reservation Indian stereotype unmistakably dominates popular culture, leaving the urban Indian an invisible majority. The urban Indian meaning those that are born in the city versus not on a reservation. Erasure narratives of American Indians persist in pedagogical spaces, and the looming question of who decides who is Native American. My grand research question for my dissertation was, what can be learned from culturally centered pedagogical practice from urban Indian college-going students when their Native identities are overlooked or contested in classroom spaces? The questions that guided my research were, what assumptions need to be challenged in our thinking about what urban Indian means? What specific perceptions about pedagogical practice stood out for urban Indian students who attended predominantly and historically white institutions? And what lessons about culturally centered pedagogical practice can be learned from urban Indian students? So I'll briefly go over three findings. So based on the question, what assumptions needed to be challenged in our thinking, I recognized very early on in my conversation with my participants that the question contained a presumption that reflected my own acceptance of this term, but not the storytellers. The response left no doubt about their disconnect and resistance to Tommy Orange's characterization of urban Indian, which is what I use to describe what an urban Indian was in terms of, for the definition for our research, so contextualizing what urban Indian was. And Tommy Orange wrote in his novel There about Indians being raised in the city. And Tommy Orange is from the Bay Area, is from Oakland, so I deeply connected with his description, but the others did not. So The responses to the question turned into problematizing what was deemed to be a romanticizing what was disregarded, what deemed to be the romanticization of the city, and was a complete disregard for the destruction of the city and the culturally sustaining land upon which the cities were built. So the students had a profound emotional response to the notion of being raised in the city without acknowledging the destruction of the land. A telling insight into these emotions was the experience of David, who talked about the distinction between urban versus reservation Indians, which in his experience meant being labeled an inauthentic Indian or not a real Indian. You should not have an opinion about Native issues, he was told. So the second finding, he also said, I heard insults like being called a cloud chaser because you didn't grow up on the res. You're only authentic if you grew up on the res. I grew up in the city, but I am still connected to my reservation, was something that he grappled with. The second question about what pedagogical practices stood out for the students was the notion of student as teacher. Student as teacher was the most common outcome when students revealed their Native identities in their classes. To be clear, student as teacher was not a role they wanted or welcomed. Instead, student as teacher left them grappling with three primary concerns. The first one was the tension to correct incorrect or inaccurate historical inferences and references about Native people, the hardship of being visible as an Indigenous person without becoming the teacher for the class of all things Native, and the possibility of creating openings for questions about their Nativeness. One of the storytellers talked about her encounters with sports mascots. She read, I grew up in a large metropolitan city where I was always asked my thoughts on mascots. I didn't know I was entitled to opinion. Assuming we all have thoughts on those things is putting someone on the spot, and particularly putting her on the spot when she really didn't feel that she could be the spokesperson for all things related to mascots. So the last finding about what can we learn about pedagogical practice is this notion of invisibility as a survival strategy. The findings suggested that students use similar approaches when negotiating learning spaces. For instance, measuring and assessing the need to guard their identities was common, and this includes myself. After an assessment of a classroom, we would enter a classroom and assess the classroom. There were times our Native identities were not shared for the purpose of minimizing emotions of anger and frustration from experiences with erasure and misinformation, while also managing fatigue from overt curiosity about Native life, cultural traditions, or guilt from non-Native people. And so one of the participants said, one of the biggest things I noticed when talking about Native identity is it depends on who you trust. So this is part of the assessment. I found no reason to talk to professors with whom I knew I would not have a relationship with. So story as a pedagogical practice appears in Indigenous ways of understanding history, teaching, learning, healing in particular. And I like Leslie Marmon-Silco's notion of story and storytelling in using this notion of a spider web. And she talks about for those accustomed to being taken from point A to point B and to point C in a story, which is a traditional Western way in which a story would be told. This presentation, my presentation, and other Indigenous presentations may be somewhat difficult to follow. Stories can be like spider webs, where many threads radiate from the center, crisscrossing one another. As with the web, the structure unfolds as it is made, listening and trusting that meaning will unfold and emerge. So as a pedagogical practice, what might that look like? So shifting on to the discovery myth. Interestingly enough, typically children's first curricular exposure is to Christopher Columbus, the story of Christopher Columbus as a discoverer. Most children, as we know, can recite the poem and know about Christopher Columbus. So the challenge with that is that the exposure encourages a disregard of different perspectives, obviously. The learning excludes critical thought, such as a counter narrative, and the story reflects only the discoverer's point of view. So when thinking about talking about these topics, what are some learning goals that we might want to avoid? And we might want to avoid goals that reflect the romanticizing and idealizing Native people, demonizing Europeans, generating a victim narrative, framing a two-sided story, such as a winner and loser. We know the typical cowboy and Indian story. It's very difficult, not necessarily related to Christopher Columbus, but it's a fallback framing that's often used. And replacing Eurocentrism with Native centrism, that should be avoided, that we're not replacing one for the other. So here are some goals to consider, ways in which we can approach these topics. Goals that deepen the understanding of the consequences related to European presence, and goals that deepen the understanding of the complex development of existing economic, political, government, social, spiritual, cultural, medicinal systems among Indigenous peoples from the beginning of contact to today. It's important to note that there are very complex systems that are present. It's important to have as a goal to deepen the understanding of problems with the winner's history narrative, and deepen our understanding of the erasure of tribal nations by troubling the terminology used to describe Native peoples as American Indian or broadly Native American, instead of using the English version of the names, such as the Shawnee, the Delaware, and the Miami, Wyandotte, and Ohio, or whatever regions that you want to be speaking about. The more you can use the tribal name, the better. So systems, as we know, change through education. As of today, well, actually this is as of 2013, 46% of states make no mention of Native Americans in K through 12 curriculum. Fortunately, Ohio does, so we don't have to be concerned about that. However, 87% of state history standards do not mention Native history after 1900. So these pictures are more common than we would find about experiences in the present day. So here are some suggestions or some questions we can think about to honor Indigenous Peoples Day and to talk about it from an academic perspective or an educational perspective. What are ways to cultivate ecological hope? Is understanding, if we're going to offer a land acknowledgement, understanding the importance of land, what is the hope that we can think about and cultivate when we talk about the land, especially following the recent oil spill off the southern coast of California? Who are the contemporary leaders in education, medicine, science, law, engineering, government, the arts, et cetera? We can talk more about contemporary people that are leading the way now, in addition to talking about Sitting Bull, Chief Joseph, and other leaders of the past. How many federally recognized tribes are there? Do we know this, as we know that there are 50 states? We know other things, we know content, or we know data, but do we know how many federally recognized tribes there are and how many there are not? What stories should be told about the 100-year boarding school era in the United States, specifically the United States? And do we even talk about Canada's experience, First Nations people's experience? And how are ways to honor the survivors, their descendants, and the children who did not survive? And we know that as of now, there have been over 6,000 graves found where children did not survive at the boarding schools. And these are predominantly in Canada, and the search is ongoing. And where are the language revitalizing efforts and programs happening? This is happening across the country and across tribal nations. The University of Miami in Oxford, Ohio has an exceptional revitalizing program. Where else are programs happening is another way to enter the conversation. So just a quick kind of overview of the federally recognized tribes. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Those are marked in the bottom right screen or bottom left screen in the teal color or turquoise color. Those in the lighter tan color are those states without federally recognized tribes, noticing that Ohio is one. All of the tribes that were in Ohio were removed during the Removal Act, as well as the other states, and Georgia stands out in particular because that's where the Trail of Tears began. And many were moved obviously west of the Mississippi and into Oklahoma. So the map to the right, the large map, the 2009-2013 American Indian Alaska Native population shows where over 100,000 Native Americans reside as of 2013 in the turquoise. I found it interesting in this map to see that there were between 25 and 50,000 people residing in Ohio. So there are people here. There are Native people here. The blurrier map shows more specifically within the states where the populations reside.
Shannon, before you move forward, I'm trying to read that caption in the bottom left hand corner, the 574 federally recognized tribes in the US. What does the beige say?
The beige says states without federally recognized tribes.
And is that current?
Yes. Ohio has no federally recognized tribes.
Huh.
They were all removed during removal.
They just have the tribes that are considered occupying land. Is that the difference?
Well, there are no reservations. There are no federally recognized tribes that reside in Ohio.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for the question and the distinction. So who are some of the leaders today? It's important that we think about that. And here's just a tiny splattering of people. Frank Wan, a tremendous Frank Wan, who identifies as Lakota, musical artist. My friend, Dr. Brian Brayboy, who is Lumbee and a professor at the Arizona State University. Christine Balji Morris is here on campus. She's a professor in arts education, education and policy. Joy Harjo is Muskie Creek, who is this U.S. Poet Laureate and is serving 2 times. She's been 2 times she's been the poet laureate, U.S. Poet Laureate. Dr. Timothy Sampedro, who is not identified as Native, but was raised, has a lived experience on the Flathead Reservation in Montana, is a professor, as you all know, in the College of Education, associate professor. Deb Howland, Laguna Pueblo and Yemenez Pueblo, is the first Native person to be on the president's cabinet, U.S. Secretary of the Interior. And Dr. Anderson, Eastern Band Cherokee, is professor, assistant professor of microbiology here at Ohio State. This is not the entire community of campus. I would take up several slides, although it's a small population, but just wanted to let you know that we are here. We are still here. And there are many, many resources that we can pull on to talk about contemporary leaders. And then there's a few of us that are just joining the game that earned our degrees in 2020 and 2021. So DeAndre Smiles earned his degree in geography in 2020 and is now an assistant professor, starting his position as assistant professor in British Columbia, Vancouver, British Columbia. Michael Charles earned his degree in chemical engineering and is serving now as a postdoc for the Newark Earthworks Center at Ohio State. So for Indigenous Peoples Day, when we think about it, it is not about changing history, not about telling, not about sharing the same story, but can we tell a different story? Crystal Echo Honey says, change the story, change the future. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, very much. I do have a lot of questions, to be honest with you. Before I engage, let's see if our audience has something they'd like to discuss and or share from the presentation, or something you'd like to ask Shannon specifically with respect to her experience. Especially, I think, Shannon, I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about what your experiences were like. You shared, obviously, a little bit about your personal story, your personal journey, but as it relates to education and higher ed, most specifically. Anyone in the room have questions for Shannon before I get started? Scott, it's good to see you. Go ahead.
First of all, I want to apologize for being late. I was running from one meeting to the other, then I couldn't log in, so I bounced in and out.
we told everybody that it was going to be kind of crazy here. So thanks for joining.
I was popping in and out. But I do have a specific question. This is related to recruitment and retention for my program specifically. There's an extreme shortage of Native American Indian psychologists and specifically school psychologists. And I was wondering, are there specific undergraduate institutions that you can point to that we can, recruit from, those kind of things? My focus on African American children in general, so I can go to HBCUs and, different McNair Scholar programs and those kind of things. But are there specific places that universities that we can look for undergraduate recruitment to get students to come to Ohio State?
Yes, there are. So Arizona State has a significant population of Native students, particularly undergrads. And in fact, Dr. Brayboy let us know that they have trouble admitting all of their students to all of their programs and was looking for partners which he could refer to. And so he's and talked to Dr. James Moore, who is the vice provost, as you probably know, of the Office of Diversity Inclusion, is how could we partner? So the schools that really, where you look at where the populations are heavy, are places where you can go. New Mexico is another one. University of New Mexico. The schools in California obviously offer significant programs. Washington, we have partners at the University of Washington, which might be a place where you might want to pursue relationships. So it's going to be important to pursue relationships with the faculty there or with the administrators there before just reaching out to the students. So Chad Allen is an associate provost at the University of Washington, who's formerly a professor here in English. And so he's going to be coming, I recently heard, in April. He'll be on campus, so he would be one to connect with. There'll be he's doing a presentation on a book he's written. So that might be one to try to make a connection with him and how you can partner to recruit students.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Because it's a big problem in our area. There's less than 1% of Native American Indian school psychologists. And so there's a big need. So I wrote those down, and thank you for the information.
Oh, you're welcome. Yes, it's a significant issue at Ohio State in general. Our population has dwindled from 200 in total across all campuses in over a 10-year period to now I just did the report. We're down to 40 across all campuses, wow. All levels.
Wow. I just think that's such a powerful, that's such an opportunity. It's such a powerful strategy. I mean, I get so bogged down in partnering and thinking about partnerships between K-12 and thinking about research, but thinking about ways that we could partner to, recruit and support both institutions. That's just, playing up the different programs that have gaps and could support each other with recruitment, especially with the, online delivery that could work. I guess there would be some finagling with, out-of-state tuition and all that kind of stuff. You'd have to sort of hammer away and try to figure out, but that's a great opportunity. Yeah.
Well, there's precedence for that. There's precedence and something that Ohio State is talking about, and we are suggesting again to the administration how other schools are doing it and how we should follow. Yeah. So many schools waive the out-of-state tuition. In other words, they do not honor the border. So the state borders are designed for a purpose, but for Indigenous people, there is a notion that you don't have to honor those borders, especially for the removed tribes. Yeah. I mean, the focus is of all people, the Shawnee, the Delaware, those identifying should not have to pay out-of-state fees to come to Ohio State.
That's awesome.
And so Colorado is doing that. Michigan has significant programs. Many states have programs. Arizona State University, of course, has programs. And so we have a list that we provided of the schools, universities that have done this and how we might model that, because we're going to have to make those significant changes in the way in which we think about inviting Native people to Ohio State. If we want Native, if we're serious about it. And that means, faculty too, and staff.
Well, the good news is that there is a process at OSU as well through the Senate Fiscal and the Student Fees Committees for this consideration of
Yes.
just what's being proposed. And it's, you know what, if you've got the evidence that Michigan's doing it,
Oh yeah, right.
that helps.
That's always at the top. We always put
Yeah.
Michigan at the top.
That helps. Competitive in the market. Yes.
Scott, I see you, but I'd like Richard. Richard's had his hand up for a minute. Richard, could you go ahead, please?
And sorry, unless Scott has a follow-up, I don't want to move topic.
Richard, it was a quick follow-up.
Okay.
Was it any way that you could provide that list to us, like specifically? I would like to put pressure on our associate chair who's in the meeting with us. Like, you know, he talks about recruitment and retention. If we can get that to him, and we could put pressure on him from our committee to get that in front of the department chair and the dean to say, even if the university is moving slower, you know, our associate chair could say, maybe that's something we could do for our programs at a department level and a college level. So if I don't know if you allow, you know, could you provide that?
Of course, it's public data. Of course, I can do that. Yeah. And I will, there's presentations that are going to be happening more broadly. The Native community has come together to create a one-page, like a white paper on a proposal, and just presented it to Dr. Moore and Tom Gregar last week. And so now there's more presentations that are going to happen to begin to move this forward, to get it on in front of the provost and the president. But I think from a departmental perspective, are there ways to address paying that out-of-state fee as a recruitment strategy? Absolutely, in lieu of making these bigger changes, although big is relative, right? For some, if we make it a priority, it's not big. Right.
Good point. Thank you. Richard, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I should introduce myself. I'm Richard Fletcher, Associate Professor in the Department of Arts, Administration, Education and Policy.
Oh, it's nice to meet you, Richard. Nice to have you here.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. And I'm very grateful to Dr. Gonzales-Miller for any presentation she gives, specifically on this topic. And also a shout out to my colleague, Christine Ballinger-Morris, who was one of those people on that list that you mentioned. Something that, and this is related to this question of waiving fees and out of state students, as probably many of you know, and Shannon, you know too, that there's this report from High Country News about the land grab university. And actually this comes back to Karen, your kind of, you know, shock about that there are no federal, you know, there's no, in Ohio, the tribes were removed before the Morrill Act.
Right.
And therefore no indigenous land in Ohio was given, and that's in quotation marks, expropriated is the technical term, for the founding of Ohio State University. So zero indigenous land from Ohio. However, there are mechanisms to track where the, thanks Mark for putting that in there, where the, there's a webinar tomorrow about it as well at 12, so with the authors. One thing we could do is we can track the indigenous nations that had land taken from them to found this university and make a case to the administration that these could be states in which scholarships can be offered and waive, or at least the waiving of out-of-state tuition, as well as the removed tribes, which is very important. Is, you know, to kind of get that balance between the removed tribes and the tribes in which, you know, resources were taken that meant that this university could be founded, that pay our salaries, that you know, all these kinds of things. And so we can literally, thanks to this amazing report and this website, we can track. And so, you know, just that's something else to think about. And also, I mean, Shannon, I was wondering where, you know, land acknowledgement is such a heated discussion here. As everywhere, but it's good that it's being discussed, and that's very important. When I think about land acknowledgement, not only of the removed tribes, but also of these, you know, these the tribal nations where expropriated land was given, I always wonder whether there could be a mention of them in the land acknowledgement, given that we are specifically a land grab grant institution. And I just wondered, just, you know, while we're here, Shan, just if that was something that you'd thought about, or, you know, do you think that adds another layer to the land acknowledgement that maybe becomes too too much? I mean, land acknowledgements are always up for negotiation and discussion, but I was just wondering what you thought about that.
No, I absolutely think that if you're going to use a land acknowledgement, and I do like that. I guess it depends on who you are and why you're offering the land acknowledgement. I do like to see it in writing when you have the opportunity. So as you're saying, if you're doing a presentation, that it would be in writing so that you can see, for those that are oral, have auditory challenges in terms of learning, so that you can see the names of the tribes. It's important that we see them as often as possible, because there are descendants that are still here. The Eastern Band Cherokee that are in Oklahoma. We have a relationship with the chief who comes back to and works with us, works particularly with Christine. So yeah, it's important that we do name them. There's controversy about who should be included, and that's where it gets really messy. Who are we leaving out? Who, do we include this group? Do we not include this group? And we're not looking specifically at what we know Ohio now. We're looking at what was the region before Ohio became a state. And so that can get a little messy. But yeah, absolutely naming the tribes is important. And I really appreciate your comments, Richard, because we've had this conversation about, within the community, within our Native group, about including the land grab information. And the community right now, but the majority of the community right now wants to really take a bridge building approach. How can what are the concerns? Let's acknowledge the challenges, but how can we partner and ally with you? How can we be a resource? But it is very helpful for others in the community who are invested in this and see the value of it to bring forward on Indigenous people's behalf this notion of the land grab. It's not something, we're not into confrontation right now. We don't want to confront the administration and say, you owe us, point fingers, you owe us. We're not taking that kind of strong activist approach or aggressive approach, but boy, can others, absolutely. I think we kind of welcome that. As long as it's for your purposes, not say on behalf of Indigenous people and the Indigenous community here, you want to do that. That's where it feels uncomfortable. You're saying, well, I know Shannon, and I know she would be appreciative of this.
So to her credit, though, Christina made in our opening Senate meeting, as well as in her opening presentation, a point to acknowledge, and not just acknowledge in speaking, but she made it available and asked that we tag it into our information, our communications. So that's the one that she provided. I put over there in the chat that you can grab and or dispute, or change as you see fit. On this land grant and acknowledgement piece, as you opened up your presentation, you talked about very clearly the importance of acknowledging not only those who have, I read in another piece, not only lived on the land, but learned and loved on the land. So the land was a space for life. And then you mentioned too, how this extends into the future. Can you expand on that a little bit more? Because other than acknowledging what was happened in the past, I know my position about how important it is to acknowledge and understand and know, and in fact, research past stories. Mm-hmm. How does that benefit us looking forward into the future, specifically with respect to the tensions that exist around the land grab and the harsh treatment of those peoples who were actually living, learning, and loving on this land?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So it's important. So when offering a land acknowledgement, it is important to both, like you mentioned, acknowledge the past, but as important to acknowledge the present and the future, because we are the caregivers for the future. We are preparing and teaching the next generation of caregivers of the land. And it is not something, because of genocide and because of removal, it is not the responsibility of Native people alone. It's all of our responsibilities to care for the land in which we live on. We may have a different relation and a different connection to Mother Earth, is what a lot of Indigenous people describe, how we describe Mother Earth and all living things. And how we honor that in every way, but we still all have a responsibility for our own survival. So what are ways in which we can think about the ways that Indigenous people protected and cultivated the land and lived in unison with the land? What can we learn today about how to do that to the land? So can Native people, can Native scientists inform agricultural practices today about how to better use the land that's not in an exploitive manner? We think about water resources, clean water. What can we learn? We know Indigenous people are fighting, and non-Indigenous people, every day about clean water rights. And the pipeline, what's called the black snake. Water is life, and the black snake is destructive, destroys water, destroys life for profit, for the way in which we view what's important to us and how we prioritize things. So water rights, land rights, we can't survive when we think about, I like the notion of thinking about the abundance of where our food comes from. Where does our food come from? Well, we know it's not the same. We have some pretty tasteless food because of the way it's being processed, right? And so how can we learn from Indigenous people? What can we learn from those that are following in the footsteps of their ancestors to take care of the land? Or lawyers that are protecting land rights, those that have land rights. So
right, love it very much. I see Belinda made a connection with the Aboriginal Australian. The Aboriginal Australians can teach us about managing wildfires and protecting the land as well. Did you want to say anything more on that? I see Elisa has her hand up too. Elisa, hold on, and I'll get to you as soon as I lob this question to Belinda if she chooses to answer.
All I can say is I was raised on 70,000 acres on a soldier settlement block in central New South Wales that was essentially a land grab by the then federal government to distribute land that was Aboriginals, belonged to our Aboriginals. And I had a fabulous experience as a kid being raised by and with my Aboriginal cousins. And one of the things that I learned as an adult, when I also lived in a very then prone to bushfires, and I know you've all heard about the bushfires in Australia over the last few years, is how land management it's so critical to understand and learn and practice from our Aboriginal ancestors, how to take care of that land to prevent those fires. And then what do you do when there is a fire? What do you do to manage it best?
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Elisa.
Hi. Thanks so much for coming, Dr. Gonzales-Miller. I'm Elisa Tate. I usually hear her pronouns. First and foremost, I really enjoy learning about Indigenous people and learning more about, I would say the lack thereof, the conversation around this particular group of population. And my first experience was later in life, even though Indigenous people existed, I think it subjectively came into the forefront for me when I went to grad school at the University of Kansas, which is also directly tied to Haskell's Indian Nation University, which is right next door, which is really cool. And I was able to understand the fact that for a lot of Indigenous students, and I really appreciate that Dr. Graves had asked the question about how to recruit students. From my experience has been for students is not losing their culture and preservation. And I know that that's huge. That's really huge for a lot of Indigenous students, Indigenous peoples, to not lose what what has been taken from them with, I would, just to be cognizant, like, Western education, right? So how do you sort of still honor you know, where they've come from and honor their tribes, you know, even if they decide to come to Ohio State, you know, will they be able to still engage in those, you know, those particular ways and still honor, you know, the past, and honor their family, honor the people. And so I'm really enjoying the conversation. And I think that's why I wanted to pose it to you, Dr. Gonzales-Miller, about, you know, we've kind of touched upon that, you know, how can, you know, if we get students to Ohio State, I love the fact that, you know, there's no borders, because it's very true. It's like, this is our land, right? You know, how do we sort of, you know, support those students in those ways, particularly of like preservation. And, you know, for a lot of students I've connected with when I was in Kansas, they talked about, like, you know, having a bloodline, like in order to go to, you know, a university, a federal or a university that is particularly for a tribal university, excuse me, you had to show like that you are part of this nation or in order to you know, to participate. So I'll wrap that up, but I'm really excited. I'm excited to be here. But I just wanted to know your thoughts on how do we, you know, how do we sort of support students in that way where they don't want to lose their culture. And it's very important. It's prevalent because of, you know, the blatant, how can I say it nicely? I don't know if I say it politely. It's like the genocide of people, right? So, you know, how do we sort of support that in that kind of way?
And I think that sort of goes into the question that I was asking you also, Shannon, through your experience as a doctoral student and or as a master's student, where did you find support? Where did you find community?
Thank you, Alyssa, for that question, and Karen for the question and the contextualizing the student's experience in this process and how important community is in the reclamation process. So when people, those of us that are in a reclamation process, and can't say that all students are, but I certainly am, because of the loss of our cultural practices, being raised by a parent who was raised in a boarding school, so without his family, because as those of you know, in boarding schools, the siblings were separated. So he had no contact with his siblings. So, because he was the youngest, all of the siblings ran away. And so he didn't have contact with them until much later in life. And I don't know if he ever did actually return to see his parents. I know he talked with his father on the phone. At one point he called to apologize, but that absence, these are stories that I know of. And part of the challenge is when telling the story, because it's not common, the story itself is deemed irrelevant or untrue. And so for that reason, during my first time at Ohio State, during my bachelor's degree, I opted not to identify. It was too painful. It was the questions and the challenges were something that I did not want to deal with. Right. So I did not reveal my identity. And in fact, I can pass, if you will, yep, as a Latinx person. Yep. So, which is what I did for my undergraduate time.
That's not as uncommon as you think.
Yeah, I know. I know that it is not in the notion of blended bodies or mixed race. How we survive is very calculated and very conscientious. So as a survival mechanism, I did become invisible. However, in the early 80s here at Ohio State, the Hispanic population predominantly spoke Spanish, and I did not. So that was a challenge. Didn't belong there either. Mm-hmm. So in quiet spaces, much like survivors of any kind of trauma talk about, if you find a partner, if you find someone that you feel comfortable telling, I would tell the story of my father. And at some point in connecting with Native communities like Christine Biology Moore's Native staff, connecting to other people, that story, someone would say, oh, I have that story. I share that story. And that's how community became important, as we're a very tight, small community. But without that community, I would not have all pursued my research. There is just absolutely no way I would have done it. Without Dr. San Pedro, absolutely not, could not have done it. Without my advisor, Dr. Tyson, encouraging me to pursue it and challenge it, because I, again, did not want to be the one that was going to demonize, berate the institution of education. I wanted to figure out how could we make changes for the generations to come. You know, what are the stories we can, so coming from an Indigenous way of knowing, which is through storytelling, what are the stories we can tell to make change, rather than how can I accuse you of, or anyone of making my life miserable. That is not my intention whatsoever.
Right.
So there, I started as a graduate student. When I started my PhD program, along with Dr. San Pedro served as the advisor, agreed to serve as an advisor, we started a graduate student organization. So DeAndre, who was in the picture, and Michael, they served as the president for 5 years. So we came together to tell our stories, to share our experiences. There are 3 undergraduate student organizations under the auspices of the Multicultural Center with Melissa Beard, who identifies as Ojibwe. And right now, Madison Eagle is also there, and she supports those efforts as well. So we need to do better. We need more. Many schools have places, significant, a space. They have a house or a place where Indigenous people can go. Michael Charles talks about that all the time. He was at Cornell, and there was a place where he could go to find faculty and find students. So much like the Frank Hale Black Cultural Center in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we do not have that, something like that for, and we know the story and the research around the value of cultural centers. So we need a center without question. But first we have to get the students. And that's our dilemma, is where do we start? Do we start with the infrastructure, or do we start with the students, or can we do both? You know,
do both and at the same time.
At the same time, yeah.
Right.
But be aware and conscious of the significance, as Alyssa mentioned, that we need to have support systems here. If we bring students, and that was part of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, where I spent 30 years in recruiting students into our scholarship programs. If we didn't have support systems, we were not going to be able to retain our students. So building personal relationships with the students is critically important.
So your numbers were really spot on and very reflective of the decline of diversity, particularly on main campus. It's an issue that the Black community is addressing and the Latina community is addressing. It seems to be the natural course to farm students from diverse backgrounds to these regionals, right? And that's not a problem, except that getting them back without that support that we're talking about is a problem, and they're not able to hang on. They're not able to continue their program and to thrive, as was mentioned, not just surviving, but thriving. Mark brought up this point about this notion of invisibility that you spoke to. If there's anything else you'd like to share in that, he would be interested in hearing. He said that was the portion of your talk that he wanted to engage further.
In terms of being invisible in I
think holding spaces, that tension of the blended body space and how you managed that. And I don't know, I don't want to speak for Mark. Is there something?
Oh yeah, sorry. And I know we're running out of time, so I don't want to take too much. You did address it. So I just wanted to thank you.
Oh, okay. Okay. That was just
for, bringing in your own personal story, because I think there is a potential tension there around like that erasure, right? Or feeling erased or made to be invisible versus using invisibility as a survival mechanism. And I don't think it's an either or, right? But it feels like there's a tension there of like wanting to be seen, not wanting to be erased, but like it's too much at times, like you
under
shared.
What conditions?
So, right.
Under what conditions? So there is an assessment, like we talked about, an assessment of safety, really, or really how am I feeling on the particular day, or how's anybody feeling on the particular day that you want to tell the story. And knowing that there are going to be questions, because it's, especially when we talk about boarding school, because it's not something that people know about. And through my experience of sharing the boarding school stories, there are some overt responses to that in terms of anger that people share because they weren't told the story. And then I feel like I want to manage and hold them in that space of uncomfortableness. But there is also then, like you mentioned, Mark, this tension of not identifying and being invisible, being othered and being invisible or erased. That's a significant. So I want to speak up, and that's something we grapple with all the time. Can I be silent? Thankfully, it's not all my burden. And what has happened is that my daughter, who Dr. San Pedro talked about and knows, and Dr. Fletcher knows, has an amazing voice. So sometimes you didn't know this notion of being too close to the story, that because I was raised in the experience, as you can tell, as I stumble and struggle over my words all the time around the story, I'm almost too close to it sometimes to be reflective, but she has got a powerful voice to tell the story of blended body, mixed body, erasure, and she's going to carry on the work that I sometimes struggle with. And Dr. Fletcher, you might want to say something about that as you get the opportunity to work with her and how generationally we pass down these stories. So she holds the story, she knows it.
Yeah, I feel very honored to work with Indigo, and I can put a link into the chat. Maybe some of you may not know, but we actually have a library of Indigenous books currently at the Columbus Printed Arts Center that's part of an arts project where Indigo is one of the contributing artists, and I'll just put the link. It's called Potu Whaitautusi, which is in Samoan means reading room, and it actually addresses some of these questions that Shannon raised about language resilience as well, because the subtitle is Be Courageous Language Teachers, and I'll put the link so you can find out about Indigo's artwork.
Please do.
And
That's
her
great.
project. And I think she is going to start some office hours in this space, so that's exciting.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. Amari, I just wanted you to know I see you, and I thank you for what you have contributed to the chat. Amari is here, and she is working on her master's thesis about Native student athletes and their college choice and academic and athletic experience. So I'm glad you chose to join us here, and I hope that you take names and numbers of folks that you can reach out to get the support that you need, not only to finish your work, but also as you are here at Ohio State and finishing up your studies, that you know that you have support. Shannon, we are out of time. I could talk to you forever, you know that, but we are out of time. I just want to say one last thing. Your poem that Dr. San Pedro and you revisited or reimagined or rewrote, you know, in retelling of your this notion of floating, I think is really kind of interesting and significant. I study, it's funny, I study flow for a totally different reason. It's called the totally different reason. But I was at a conference and a woman came to me because I was talking about this notion of flow. And she said, I'm also a daughter of the waters. And I kind of looked at her and thinking, what are you saying? What is this? And she said, my name is Many Rivers. And then she talked to me about, and then she asked me, what is your research? So it was an interesting connection that this water notion does have, but this whole thing of floating and the significance that you attributed to it, that you are blending and swirling in the water, was very much what she was saying about her lineage and legacy of many rivers coming together, and how she was moving through life holding all of the waters from many different rivers. And it was a beautiful story, and I really appreciated your story as well. So thank you very much.
Floating in terms of floating on my back is what my father taught me. So I could navigate any waters, whether it was the Pacific Ocean, the Russian River, a lake, a pool.
Love it.
That when I got tired, I was to float on my back. So thank you for acknowledging that. And Amari, I have been looking for you. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're here. I need to talk to you. I'm going to follow up we need someone for our organization, and I need to reach out to you. So
well, we are just a little bit over time, so I'm going to leave the room open so you two can reconnect. And for the rest of you, thank you so much for joining us. And I know it was a small group, but I got to be honest, this was one of the best conversations I've had. So I thank you so much, Shannon, for that. And for those of you who joined us, thank you for your time. I know it's a busy week for all of us, so it really means a lot that you took the time to be here and to support not only the series, but also most specifically Shannon. We appreciate you so very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And also, if there's anything else that's left unsaid, I would invite you all to steal the chat, because there's good links in there. Just go ahead and hit those little 3 dots down at the bottom, and it'll ask you if you want to save the chat. Hit save, and then you have it. And you can revisit those links at any point in time you want. One day, Shannon, I want to sit down and talk to you about this notion of an urban Indian and why Native Americans choose to call themselves urban Indian and not urban Native. And then that whole notion around, the Asian perspective on Indian. So that'll be a conversation for another day.
Absolutely.
We'll do that another time. I'm just planting a seed to bring you back, babe. You guys have a great afternoon, and thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone, for your support. Ooh, Amari.